Behind the golden gates of royal privilege lies a world where loyalty can turn deadly in seconds. When King George's most trusted guard discovers a shocking truth about the monarch's hidden past, a single moment of revelation threatens to destroy everything the royal family has built. What happens when the protector becomes the threat and the protected becomes the target? In a world where secrets are currency and trust is a luxury few can afford, one guard's discovery will change the course of royal history forever. The question isn't what George is hiding, it's what lengths he'll go to keep it buried. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who know you best. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Captain Marcus Sterling adjusted his uniform for what he believed would be another routine day protecting the royal family. 23 years of service had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated when something was different, and today carried an electric tension that made the hair on his arms stand upright. The other guards whispered among themselves in corners, their usual confident demeanor replaced by nervous glances and hushed conversations that stopped whenever he approached. Marcus had earned his position through unwavering loyalty and exceptional skills, rising through the ranks to become the most trusted member of King George's personal security detail. His reputation was built on his ability to anticipate threats before they materialized, a sixth sense that had saved royal lives more times than the public would ever know. Today, however, that same instinct was telling him that the danger wasn't coming from outside the palace walls. Queen Camilla moved through the corridors with her usual grace, but Marcus noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she greeted the staff. Her smile, practiced and perfect for decades, didn't quite reach her eyes. She had been acting strangely for weeks, jumping at unexpected sounds and requesting additional security for events that had never required extra protection before. When Marcus had asked about her concerns, she had dismissed them with a wave of her hand, claiming it was simply the stress of upcoming state functions. The morning briefing revealed nothing unusual in the official reports, but Marcus caught glimpses of documents being hastily shuffled away when he entered the security office. His fellow officers, men he had served alongside for years, avoided making direct eye contact. The atmosphere was thick with secrets that nobody seemed willing to share, creating an environment of suspicion that was entirely foreign to the normally tight-knit security team. King George had been equally evasive, cancelling his regular morning walks and refusing to leave his private chambers for anything other than essential meetings. When Marcus did see him, the monarch appeared haggard and worn, his usually perfect posture replaced by a slight hunch that suggested he was carrying an enormous burden. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and his nervous habit of constantly adjusting his clothing had become more pronounced. As the day progressed, Marcus began to notice a pattern in the unusual behavior surrounding him. Staff members would fall silent when he approached, conversations would shift to mundane topics, and he caught several people watching him, with expressions that ranged from pity to fear. The realization that he was being deliberately excluded from something significant sent a chill down his spine. In his years of service, he had never been treated as anything other than a trusted confidant. The breakthrough came during his routine security sweep of the King's private wing. Marcus had performed this check thousands of times, but today he noticed that one of the supposedly secured doors was slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening, he could hear King George's voice, strained and desperate, speaking to someone in hushed tones. The conversation was fragmented, but certain words stood out with startling clarity: betrayal, discovery, elimination, and most chilling of all, Marcus's own name. His blood ran cold as he realized that the man he had devoted his life to protecting was discussing him as a potential threat. The loyalty that had defined his entire adult life suddenly felt like a weapon pointed at his own heart. Marcus pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more while fighting the urge to burst into the room and demand an explanation for what sounded like a plot against his life. King George's voice carried a tone Marcus had never heard before, filled with a desperate urgency that suggested he was running out of time and options. The monarch spoke about keeping certain information hidden, about the necessity of maintaining appearances, and about the unfortunate reality that some sacrifices were required for the greater good. Each word felt like a dagger being slowly twisted in Marcus's chest as he began to understand that his years of faithful service might mean nothing if he had somehow become inconvenient. The conversation shifted to discussions of timing and methods, causing Marcus's military training to kick into high gear. His mind automatically began assessing escape routes and defensive positions while his heart struggled to accept that the man he had sworn to protect with his life was potentially planning to take his. The betrayal was so complete and unexpected that he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the royal family he had served. As voices inside the room began to move closer to the door, Marcus retreated to a safe distance, his mind racing with questions that demanded immediate answers. Who was King George speaking with, and why did they consider Marcus dangerous enough to warrant elimination? What information could he possibly possess that would make his continued existence a threat to the crown? The pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed were slowly beginning to form a picture that terrified him. The remainder of his shift passed in a blur of hyper-awareness and paranoia. Every glance from a colleague seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Every routine interaction felt like it might be his last. Marcus found himself cataloguing the faces of people he had trusted implicitly, wondering which of them might already know about the plan to remove him from the equation. The palace that had been his second home for over 2 decades suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated prison. That evening, as Marcus prepared to end his shift, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home to his modest flat outside London, he chose to remain in the palace, using his security clearance to access areas that would normally be off-limits during night hours. If King George was planning something against him, Marcus needed to understand what he had done to deserve such treatment, and what information he supposedly possessed that made him so dangerous. The night security systems that Marcus had helped design now worked against him as he moved through the darkened corridors like a ghost in his own domain. Every camera angle was memorized, every guard rotation was predictable, and every hiding spot was familiar territory. He had spent years learning the palace's secrets to better protect its inhabitants, never imagining that those same skills would one day be used to protect himself from them. His destination was King George's private study, a room where the monarch kept his most personal documents and conducted his most sensitive conversations. Marcus knew the security protocols by heart, having helped establish them, and he understood exactly how to bypass them without triggering any alarms. The irony wasn't lost on him that his expertise in protecting the king might now be the only thing that could save his own life. The study was exactly as he expected to find it, with papers scattered across the massive oak desk and filing cabinets that contained decades of royal correspondence. Marcus began his search methodically, looking for anything that might explain why his name had come up in such an ominous context. His hands shook slightly as he rifled through documents, each page potentially containing the answer to questions that could determine whether he lived or died. The discovery came in the form of a folder buried deep within a locked drawer, its contents more shocking than anything Marcus could have imagined. Inside were photographs, medical records, and detailed reports that painted a picture of King George's past that was completely at odds with the public image he had maintained for decades. The documents revealed a history of violence, questionable decisions, and cover-ups that would destroy the monarchy if they ever became public knowledge. As Marcus studied the evidence before him, he began to understand why his continued existence might be considered a threat. The dates on some of the documents coincided with incidents he had witnessed during his early years of service, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on an entirely different meaning. He possessed first-hand knowledge that could corroborate the damning evidence in the files, making him an incredibly dangerous witness to royal crimes that were supposed to remain buried forever. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the study sent Marcus's heart racing as he quickly photographed the most incriminating documents with his phone before returning everything to its original position. He had found the answers he was looking for, but those answers had created an entirely new set of problems. Knowledge that could destroy the monarchy was now his burden to carry, and he understood that King George would stop at nothing to ensure that burden was permanently lifted from his shoulders. The next morning would bring new challenges and impossible choices for Marcus Sterling. Armed with information that could topple the crown but carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of loyalty, he would have to decide between his duty to the truth and his oath to protect the royal family. The collision of these two forces would set in motion events that would change the course of British history and transform a loyal guard into the most dangerous man in the kingdom. The dawn brought no relief to Marcus Sterling as he sat in his car outside the palace gates, staring at the imposing structure that had been his life's work and was now potentially his death sentence. The photographs on his phone felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, each image containing enough explosive information to bring down the entire British monarchy. Sleep had been impossible as his mind raced through the implications of what he had discovered and the limited options available to him. King George's past, as revealed by the hidden documents, painted a picture of a man who had used his position and power to cover up incidents that ranged from questionable to criminal. The medical records detailed injuries that couldn't be explained by official royal engagements, suggesting a history of violence that had been carefully hidden from the public. Most disturbing were the witness statements that had been buried, describing incidents where the future king had demonstrated a capacity for brutality that was completely at odds with his public persona. Marcus understood now why his name had come up in that overheard conversation. He had been present during several of the incidents mentioned in the files, his loyal silence having been taken for granted over the years at the time. He had accepted the explanations offered by senior officials, trusting that his superiors knew best and that his job was simply to protect, not to question. The realization that his unwavering loyalty had made him complicit in covering up serious crimes created a knot in his stomach that seemed to grow tighter with each passing moment. The morning briefing took on an entirely different character as Marcus watched his colleagues with new eyes. Every instruction seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Every assignment felt like it might be designed to isolate him or put him in a vulnerable position. The paranoia was overwhelming, but Marcus knew it wasn't unfounded given what he had overheard the previous day. His fellow guards, men he had trusted with his life countless times, might now be the instruments of his destruction. Queen Camilla's behavior had become even more erratic, her nervousness now making perfect sense in light of what Marcus had discovered. She was clearly aware of her husband's dark past and the potential consequences if it ever became public knowledge. Her requests for additional security weren't about protecting herself from external threats, but rather about managing the internal crisis that threatened to tear the royal family apart from within. The test of Marcus's newfound knowledge came sooner than expected, when King George requested a private meeting in his study, the same room where Marcus had made his shocking discovery just hours earlier. The summons felt like a trap, but refusing would have raised suspicions that Marcus couldn't afford to arouse. As he walked through the corridors toward what might be his final meeting with the monarch, Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his service weapon, a habit that now carried deadly significance. King George appeared even more haggard than before, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the stress that was clearly eating him alive. The monarch's hand shook slightly as he poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter that had been a gift from a foreign dignitary, the amber liquid sloshing against the sides of the glass like his nerves. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from carrying secrets that were too heavy for any one person to bear. The conversation began innocuously enough, with King George asking about security arrangements for upcoming public appearances and expressing concerns about potential threats from Republican activists. However, Marcus could sense an undercurrent of tension that suggested the meeting had a much more serious purpose. The monarch's eyes kept darting toward the filing cabinets where the damning documents were stored, as if he could somehow detect that they had been disturbed. The turning point came when King George began asking seemingly casual questions about Marcus's loyalty and his understanding of the oath he had taken when joining the Royal Protection Service. The monarch spoke about the importance of discretion and the sometimes difficult choices that had to be made for the greater good of the crown and the country. Each word felt like a probe, testing to see how much Marcus knew and how he might react to various scenarios. Marcus found himself walking a tightrope, trying to appear loyal and unsuspecting, while internally screaming at the injustice of the situation. The man he had devoted his life to protecting was essentially threatening him for potentially knowing information that could expose crimes that should never have been committed in the first place. The irony was almost overwhelming, but Marcus forced himself to maintain his composure and respond in ways that wouldn't reveal his true knowledge. The meeting took a darker turn when King George began discussing hypothetical scenarios involving security breaches and the measures that might be necessary to contain them. He spoke about individuals who might possess sensitive information and the unfortunate reality that national security sometimes required difficult decisions about such people. The threats were veiled but unmistakable, and Marcus realized that he was being given a final warning about the consequences of betraying royal secrets. As the conversation continued, Marcus noticed that King George's shirt had shifted slightly, revealing what appeared to be extensive scarring on his back. The sight sent a chill through Marcus's body as he realized that the medical records he had discovered were telling only part of the story. The monarch's injuries were far more extensive than the documents had indicated, suggesting a level of violence and trauma that went beyond anything Marcus had imagined. The scars appeared to be old but severe, creating a pattern that spoke of systematic brutality rather than accidents or isolated incidents. Marcus found himself staring despite his efforts to maintain eye contact with the king, his mind racing to understand how such injuries could have been sustained and why they had been kept secret for so many years. The physical evidence of past trauma added a new dimension to the crisis, suggesting that King George himself might have been a victim before becoming a perpetrator. King George noticed Marcus's attention to his injuries and quickly adjusted his clothing to cover them, but not before a flash of vulnerability crossed his features. For just a moment, the powerful monarch looked like a frightened child trying to hide evidence of abuse, and Marcus felt an unexpected surge of sympathy that complicated his already conflicted feelings about the situation. The realization that the man who was threatening his life might also be carrying his own traumatic secrets added layers of complexity that Marcus wasn't prepared to handle. The meeting ended with King George issuing what amounted to a final warning, disguised as concern for Marcus's well-being. The monarch spoke about the dangers that could befall those who became too curious about matters that didn't concern them, and he expressed hope that Marcus would continue to demonstrate the loyalty and discretion that had made him such a valuable member of the security team. The words were chosen carefully, but their meaning was crystal clear. As Marcus left the study, his mind was reeling from the implications of what he had seen and heard. The scars on King George's back suggested a history of victimization that might explain, though not excuse, his later actions. The question now was whether Marcus could find a way to expose the truth without becoming another casualty in a cycle of violence that seemed to span decades. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine duties performed, while Marcus's mind worked frantically to develop a plan that might allow him to survive the increasingly dangerous situation. He knew that simply walking away wasn't an option, as his knowledge made him a permanent threat to the crown. He also knew that going public with his information would likely result in his death before he could tell his story to anyone who mattered. The solution, when it came to him, was elegantly simple but incredibly risky. Marcus would need to find a way to make his continued existence more valuable to the royal family than his elimination. This would require gathering additional evidence, finding allies within the system, and carefully orchestrating a revelation that would force King George to choose between exposure and cooperation. That evening, Marcus began putting his plan into motion by reaching out to contacts in the media and law enforcement who might be willing to serve as insurance policies against his untimely demise. He carefully crafted messages that would be delivered automatically if he failed to check in at regular intervals, ensuring that his death would trigger the very exposure that the royal family was trying to prevent. The pieces were now in place for a confrontation that would determine not only Marcus's fate, but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. The loyal guard who had discovered his master's dark secrets was about to become the most dangerous man in the kingdom. Armed with information that could destroy the crown and the determination to use it if necessary to save his own life. The tension within the palace walls had reached a breaking point as Marcus Sterling continued his dangerous game of cat and mouse with the royal family. 3 days had passed since his discovery of the damning documents, and the psychological pressure of maintaining his facade while preparing for what might be a fight for his life was taking its toll. Every interaction felt scripted, every conversation seemed to carry hidden meanings, and every moment brought him closer to a confrontation that could end with either his vindication or his death. Marcus had spent countless hours analyzing the patterns of behavior among the palace staff, looking for signs that might indicate when and how the royal family planned to move against him. The changes were subtle but unmistakable to someone with his training and experience. Certain guards had been reassigned to positions that would give them clear shots at his usual posts. Maintenance schedules had been altered to create opportunities for accidents, and his own duty roster had been modified in ways that would isolate him from potential witnesses. The most disturbing development was the arrival of new security personnel who claimed to be temporary replacements for guards who were supposedly taking leave. Marcus recognized the type immediately: former military special operations soldiers, whose skills were more suited to elimination than protection. Their presence confirmed his worst fears about the royal family's intentions, while also providing him with valuable intelligence about the timeline of their plans. Queen Camilla had become increasingly agitated, her attempts to maintain royal composure growing more strained with each passing day. Marcus observed her during public appearances, noting the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, and the haunted look that had taken permanent residence in her eyes. She was clearly struggling with the knowledge of what was being planned, torn between loyalty to her husband and what appeared to be genuine affection for Marcus, who had protected her faithfully for years. The breakthrough in Marcus's investigation came through an unexpected source: palace surveillance footage that he had accessed using his security clearance. While reviewing recordings from the night of his discovery in King George's study, Marcus noticed something that had escaped his attention during his initial panicked search. The cameras had captured images of another person entering and leaving the study area around the same time, someone who had access to the highest levels of royal security. The figure on the surveillance footage was Lord Pemberton, the king's private secretary and one of the most trusted advisors in the royal household. Marcus had always respected Pemberton as a man of integrity and discretion, making his apparent involvement in the conspiracy all the more shocking. The timestamps on the footage revealed that Pemberton had been in the study just minutes before Marcus arrived, suggesting that he might have been the person King George was speaking with during that overheard conversation about elimination. Armed with this new information, Marcus began developing a more sophisticated understanding of the forces arrayed against him. This wasn't simply a case of a paranoid monarch trying to silence a potentially troublesome guard. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving multiple levels of the royal household. The realization that Lord Pemberton was involved suggested that the cover-up of King George's past crimes had been ongoing for decades, with trusted advisors helping to maintain the facade. The evidence against Lord Pemberton became even more compelling when Marcus discovered that the private secretary had access to a safe deposit box at a bank in Switzerland, a detail that had emerged during routine security background checks that Marcus had never paid attention to before. The existence of foreign financial accounts raised questions about how much money had been spent over the years to keep King George's secrets buried, and whether other crimes might have been committed in service of the cover-up. Marcus's investigation took on new urgency when he realized that the time for passive information gathering was rapidly running out. The new security personnel were becoming more aggressive in their surveillance of his movements, and he had noticed that his access to certain areas of the palace was being quietly restricted. The noose was tightening, and he needed to act before his enemies decided that the risk of exposure was less dangerous than allowing him to continue his investigation. The decision to confront Lord Pemberton directly was risky, but Marcus felt that he needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy before making his next move. The private secretary was known for taking evening walks through the palace gardens, a habit that provided the perfect opportunity for a private conversation away from the ears and eyes of other conspirators. Marcus used his knowledge of the security protocols to arrange a seemingly accidental encounter that would allow him to gauge Pemberton's involvement and potentially turn him into an ally. The confrontation in the gardens revealed the true depth of the conspiracy and the lengths to which the royal household had gone to protect King George's secrets. Lord Pemberton, initially startled by Marcus's unexpected approach, quickly realized that the guard knew far more than was safe for anyone involved. The private secretary's reaction was a mixture of fear, resignation, and what appeared to be genuine regret for the situation that had developed. Pemberton's confession was more comprehensive than Marcus had dared to hope, revealing a network of cover-ups, bribes, and threats that stretched back more than 30 years. The private secretary had been a young man when he first became aware of King George's violent tendencies, and he had been gradually drawn into the conspiracy through a combination of loyalty, fear, and financial incentives. The Swiss bank accounts contained funds that had been used to silence witnesses, pay off victims, and ensure that damaging evidence never saw the light of day. The most shocking revelation was that King George's injuries, the scars that Marcus had glimpsed during their meeting, were the result of an assassination attempt that had been covered up to avoid embarrassing questions about why someone had wanted to kill the future king. The attack had been carried out by the family member of one of George's victims, and the subsequent cover-up had required the elimination of several witnesses who might have connected the dots. Lord Pemberton's emotional breakdown during the confession revealed the psychological toll that decades of complicity had taken on a man who had once believed he was serving the greater good. The private secretary spoke of sleepless nights, constant anxiety, and the growing certainty that the conspiracy he had helped maintain was eventually going to collapse under its own weight. Marcus's investigation was simply the latest in a series of close calls that had brought them all to the brink of exposure. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Pemberton revealed that he had been secretly documenting everything for years, keeping detailed records of the conspiracy as insurance against the possibility that he might someday be sacrificed to protect the crown. The private secretary had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the violence that seemed to follow King George wherever he went, and he had begun to prepare for the day when his own conscience would no longer allow him to participate in the cover-up. Marcus realized that he had found a potential ally in Lord Pemberton, but the private secretary's cooperation came with a price. Pemberton wanted assurances that any exposure of the conspiracy would focus on King George rather than the people who had been coerced into helping him maintain his secrets. The private secretary painted himself as another victim of the monarch's manipulation, a characterization that Marcus found both compelling and somewhat self-serving. The alliance between Marcus and Lord Pemberton was solidified when the private secretary revealed that King George was planning to have Marcus killed within the next 48 hours. The assassination would be disguised as an accident during a routine security exercise, with the new military personnel providing the necessary expertise to ensure that no evidence would point back to the royal family. The timeline gave Marcus very little room for maneuvering, but it also provided him with the concrete evidence of intent that he needed to justify more aggressive action. The remainder of their conversation focused on developing a strategy that would allow both men to survive the crisis while ensuring that King George's crimes were finally exposed to the public. Pemberton's documentation would provide the historical context and evidence of the ongoing conspiracy, while Marcus's first-hand knowledge and recent discoveries would give the story immediacy and credibility. Together, they had enough information to bring down not only King George but potentially the entire institution of the monarchy. The plan they developed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its potential consequences. Marcus and Lord Pemberton would work together to gather the remaining evidence they needed, while simultaneously reaching out to trusted journalists and law enforcement officials who could provide protection once the story broke. They would have to move quickly and carefully, knowing that any mistake could result in their deaths and the permanent burial of the truth they were trying to expose. As the two conspirators parted ways in the darkened gardens, both understood that they had passed a point of no return. The next 48 hours would determine whether they would emerge as heroes who had exposed a decades-long conspiracy, or as the latest victims of a system that had proven itself capable of extraordinary violence in service of maintaining its secrets. The loyal guard and the conflicted private secretary were about to become the most dangerous men in the kingdom, armed with the truth and the determination to see it revealed, regardless of the personal cost. The final 24 hours before the planned assassination attempt against Marcus Sterling began with an atmosphere of deadly calm that reminded him of the moments before major military operations during his earlier service. The palace maintained its usual rhythm of ceremonies and duties, but beneath the surface, two separate conspiracies were racing toward an inevitable collision that would reshape the British monarchy forever. Marcus and Lord Pemberton had spent the previous day gathering the final pieces of evidence they needed, while simultaneously preparing for what they both knew would be their last chance to expose the truth. Marcus had used his remaining time and access to compile a comprehensive dossier that detailed not only King George's historical crimes, but also the current conspiracy to eliminate anyone who might threaten the royal family's carefully constructed facade. The evidence included photographs of the hidden documents, recordings of conversations between conspirators, financial records showing payments to silence witnesses, and most damning of all, communications that explicitly discussed the plan to murder Marcus during the upcoming security exercise. Lord Pemberton had proven to be a more valuable ally than Marcus had initially hoped, providing not only his own extensive documentation, but also introducing Marcus to a network of palace insiders who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conspiracy. These individuals included a senior palace physician who had been forced to falsify medical records, a long-time royal accountant who had been manipulating financial documents, and even a member of the ceremonial guard who had witnessed incidents that were later covered up. The most crucial addition to their alliance was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the palace physician who had been treating King George's injuries for more than a decade. Dr. Mitchell had maintained detailed medical records that contradicted the official explanations for the monarch's various injuries, and she had been growing increasingly concerned about her role in helping to hide evidence of violence. Her medical expertise would provide crucial credibility to their allegations, while her position within the palace hierarchy would make her testimony difficult to dismiss. The security exercise that was intended to provide cover for Marcus's assassination was scheduled to take place in the palace's underground training facility, a location that would allow the new military personnel to stage an accident with minimal witnesses. Marcus had studied the facility's layout extensively, identifying multiple escape routes and defensive positions that might give him an advantage if the operation went according to the royal family's plan. However, he had no intention of allowing the exercise to proceed as scheduled. Instead, Marcus and his allies had developed a strategy that would turn the assassination attempt into an opportunity to expose the entire conspiracy in the most public way possible. They had arranged for trusted journalists from multiple news organizations to be positioned near the palace, ready to receive and publish the evidence at precisely the right moment. Law enforcement officials who had been secretly investigating rumors about royal corruption had also been alerted, ensuring that the story would have official backing once it broke. The key to their plan was timing. They needed to reveal the conspiracy just moments before the assassination attempt was scheduled to begin, giving King George and his co-conspirators no opportunity to call off the operation or develop alternative strategies. The public exposure of the plot would make it impossible for the royal family to proceed with Marcus's murder, while simultaneously ensuring that the broader conspiracy could no longer be hidden from public scrutiny. Queen Camilla had become an increasingly tragic figure as the final hours approached, her knowledge of what was planned clearly tearing her apart emotionally. Marcus had observed her during what he knew might be their final interactions, noting the way she seemed to be memorizing his face, as if she already considered him dead. Her obvious distress suggested that she had argued against the assassination plan, but had been overruled by her husband and his advisors, leaving her to wrestle with her conscience while maintaining her royal obligations. The Queen's internal struggle became even more apparent during a private moment when she approached Marcus, ostensibly to discuss security arrangements for an upcoming charity event. Her words were carefully chosen to avoid any direct admission of knowledge about the conspiracy, but her underlying message was unmistakable. She was warning him to be careful and expressing regret for events that were beyond her power to prevent. The conversation left Marcus with a profound sense of sadness for a woman who had become trapped in a situation that violated her basic human decency. King George himself had become increasingly erratic as the time for action approached, alternating between periods of manic confidence and deep paranoia that suggested he was losing his psychological balance under the pressure. Marcus observed the monarch during official functions, noting the way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching, and the haunted expression that had replaced his usual regal composure. The weight of decades of violence and cover-ups was clearly taking its toll on a man who had once seemed unshakable in his arrogance. The most disturbing aspect of King George's behavior was his growing fixation on Marcus, seeking out opportunities for unnecessary interactions, and watching the guard with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The monarch seemed to be savoring the anticipation of his enemy's destruction, while simultaneously trying to convince himself that the murder was justified by national security concerns. The psychological deterioration was so pronounced that Marcus began to wonder whether the stress of maintaining his secrets for so many years had finally pushed King George over the edge into genuine madness. The turning point came when Dr. Mitchell made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about King George's condition. While reviewing the monarch's recent medical files in preparation for her testimony, the physician found evidence that the king had been receiving psychiatric medication that was not listed in his official health records. The undocumented treatment suggested that King George's mental state was far more fragile than anyone had realized, and that he might be suffering from psychological disorders that could explain his history of violence. The revelation about King George's mental health medication opened up entirely new questions about the monarchy's stability and the appropriateness of allowing someone with serious psychological issues to remain on the throne. Dr. Mitchell's analysis of the medication regimen suggested that the king was being treated for conditions that could include paranoid personality disorder, explosive anger syndrome, and possibly even early-stage dementia. The implications were staggering, as they raised questions about how many of the monarch's decisions over the years had been influenced by untreated mental illness. Armed with this additional evidence, Marcus and his allies refined their strategy to include demands for a comprehensive mental health evaluation of King George as part of any resolution to the crisis. The medical evidence would provide another layer of justification for their actions, while potentially offering the royal family a face-saving explanation for the monarch's crimes. Mental illness might not excuse decades of violence and cover-ups, but it could provide a framework for understanding how the situation had developed. The final preparations for their operation required Marcus to maintain his normal routines, while secretly positioning himself for what would likely be the most dangerous day of his life. He had arranged for copies of all evidence to be stored in multiple secure locations, ensuring that his death would not prevent the truth from being revealed. His allies had been given detailed instructions about how to proceed if he was killed, and the journalists who would break the story had been provided with enough background information to move forward even without his personal testimony. The evening before the planned security exercise, Marcus experienced a profound moment of clarity about the path that had led him to this point. 23 years of loyal service had prepared him for this moment, though not in the way he had originally intended. His expertise in protection and security would now be used to protect the truth rather than the people who had betrayed his trust. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest act of service to the crown might be the one that brought it down. As Marcus prepared for what might be his final night, he reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a loyal protector into the monarchy's most dangerous enemy. The discovery of King George's crimes had shattered his faith in the institution he had served, but it had also clarified his true duty: to protect the innocent and ensure that justice was served, even when it meant turning against those he had sworn to defend. The guard who had once been willing to die for the royal family was now prepared to risk everything to expose their darkest secrets. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either vindicate Marcus's actions or result in his death. But either outcome would serve the greater purpose of bringing truth to light. The loyal guard who had discovered his master's secrets was about to become the catalyst for the most significant crisis in the modern history of the British monarchy, armed with evidence that could topple a dynasty and the courage to use it when the moment of truth finally arrived. The morning of the security exercise arrived with an ominous stillness that seemed to hang over the entire palace complex like a shroud. Marcus Sterling had spent the final hours before dawn reviewing his plans one last time, checking and rechecking the communication systems that would allow him to coordinate with his allies. When the moment of truth arrived, the weight of the evidence he carried felt heavier than his body armor, each document and recording representing years of carefully hidden crimes that were finally about to be exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. The early morning briefing for the security exercise proceeded exactly as Marcus had expected, with the newly arrived military personnel taking prominent roles in explaining procedures that were supposedly designed to test the palace's defensive capabilities. Their true purpose was thinly veiled, and Marcus could see the predatory anticipation in their eyes as they described scenarios that would place him in isolated and vulnerable positions. The exercise was scheduled to begin at precisely 11 o'clock, giving Marcus and his allies a narrow window to execute their counter-operation. Lord Pemberton had positioned himself in the palace communication center, ostensibly to monitor the exercise, but actually to coordinate the simultaneous release of evidence to journalists and law enforcement agencies around the world. The private secretary's decades of experience in managing royal communications would prove invaluable in ensuring that the story reached the right people at exactly the right time, making it impossible for the royal family to contain or control the narrative. Dr. Roche, Mitchell had prepared comprehensive medical documentation that would support the allegations of both historical violence and current mental instability, while the other palace insiders had taken positions that would allow them to serve as witnesses to any attempts at cover-up or retaliation. The network of conspirators that had once served to hide King George's crimes was now being matched by an equally sophisticated organization dedicated to exposing them. The crucial moment arrived at 10:30 in the morning, when Marcus received a seemingly routine communication from the exercise coordinators, instructing him to report to a specific location in the underground facility. The message contained subtle indicators that confirmed this was the beginning of the assassination attempt, triggering the prearranged signal that would set everything in motion. Within seconds, copies of the evidence began flowing to news organizations across the globe, while law enforcement agencies received detailed briefings about the conspiracy they were about to help expose. Marcus made his way toward the underground facility, knowing that he was walking into a trap, but confident that the trap would ultimately ensnare those who had set it rather than their intended victim. His extensive knowledge of the palace's security systems allowed him to move through areas that the assassins had not anticipated, while his military training prepared him for the combat that was almost certainly waiting in the facility's depths. The confrontation began exactly as Marcus had predicted, with the military personnel attempting to stage an accident that would explain his death during the exercise. However, their plan immediately began to unravel when they realized that Marcus was not going to cooperate with his own murder. The underground facility became a battlefield, as trained killers found themselves facing an opponent who knew their tactics and had prepared for their assault. The sound of gunfire echoing through the palace's lower levels served as a signal for Lord Pemberton to accelerate the release of evidence, ensuring that news of the assassination attempt would be accompanied by comprehensive documentation of the conspiracy that had motivated it. The timing was perfect, creating a situation where King George and his co-conspirators would be unable to deny their involvement or claim that Marcus had been killed accidentally. Above ground, chaos erupted as palace staff and security personnel struggled to understand what was happening in the depths of their supposedly secure facility. Queen Camilla's reaction confirmed everything that Marcus and his allies had suspected about her knowledge of the conspiracy, as she immediately began demanding to know whether they had gone through with their plan. Her obvious distress and specific language provided additional evidence of the royal family's involvement in the plot against Marcus. King George's response to the crisis revealed the full extent of his psychological deterioration, as he alternated between rage at the failure of the assassination attempt and panic at the realization that his secrets were being exposed simultaneously across multiple media platforms. The monarch's erratic behavior provided compelling support for Dr. Mitchell's medical evidence about his mental state, while his increasingly desperate attempts to control the situation only served to make his guilt more obvious. The underground battle concluded with Marcus successfully fighting his way to safety while leaving behind several wounded assassins whose presence in the palace could not be explained by any legitimate security function. The physical evidence of the assassination attempt, combined with the medical treatment required by the wounded attackers, created an undeniable record of the royal family's involvement in attempted murder. The exposure of the conspiracy through multiple media outlets created an immediate international sensation that made any further cover-up attempts impossible. News organizations around the world began reporting on decades of royal crimes, supported by documentation that had been verified by multiple independent sources. The story dominated headlines across the globe as the full scope of King George's violent history and the subsequent cover-up became public knowledge. Law enforcement agencies moved quickly to secure evidence and protect witnesses, while government officials struggled to address the constitutional crisis created by the revelation that the monarch had been involved in serious criminal activities. The calls for King George's abdication began within hours of the story breaking, as political leaders recognized that the monarchy's survival depended on distancing itself from the disgraced king. Queen Camilla's position became untenable as evidence emerged of her knowledge of the conspiracy, despite her apparent reluctance to participate in the violence. Her emotional breakdown during a hastily called press conference provided a human face to the tragedy while confirming the authenticity of the allegations against her husband. The Queen's visible distress and her repeated apologies to the British people created a stark contrast with King George's defiant refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. The investigation that followed Marcus's survival and the exposure of the conspiracy revealed the full extent of the network that had been built to protect the royal family's secrets. Dozens of individuals who had participated in cover-ups, bribery and witness intimidation were arrested, while financial records showed that millions of pounds had been spent over the years to maintain the facade of royal respectability. King George's abdication became inevitable, as the evidence against him continued to mount and public pressure for his removal reached overwhelming levels. The monarch's final public appearance was a pathetic spectacle of denial and rage, as he refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the charges against him, while simultaneously threatening retaliation against those who had exposed his crimes. His obvious mental instability only served to reinforce the arguments for his removal from the throne. The constitutional crisis sparked by the revelations forced a fundamental re-examination of the role of the monarchy in modern British society. Public opinion polls showed that a majority of citizens had lost faith in the institution, while political leaders debated whether the monarchy could survive the scandal or whether the country should transition to a republican form of government. Marcus Sterling emerged from the crisis as a reluctant hero whose courage in exposing the truth had potentially saved countless future victims of royal violence. However, his victory came at a tremendous personal cost, as his faith in the institutions he had served was permanently shattered. The guard, who had once been willing to die for the crown, now found himself questioning everything he had believed about duty, loyalty, and service. The long-term consequences of the royal crisis extended far beyond the immediate scandal. As investigators continued to uncover evidence of other crimes and cover-ups that had been hidden for decades, the revelation that the British monarchy had been built on a foundation of violence and deception created ripple effects throughout the Commonwealth nations, many of which began reconsidering their relationship with the crown. In the end, the crisis that began with a loyal guard's accidental discovery of his master's secrets resulted in the most significant transformation of the British political system in centuries. The exposure of King George's crimes and the conspiracy to hide them demonstrated that no institution, regardless of its historical importance or cultural significance, could remain above the law indefinitely. The truth had finally emerged, carried into the light by individuals who understood that justice was more important than loyalty to those who had betrayed the trust placed in them. The palace that had once been a symbol of stability and tradition became the site of ongoing investigations and soul-searching about the nature of power and accountability in democratic societies. Marcus Sterling's courage in facing down those who would have killed him to protect their secrets had not only saved his own life, but it also preserved the possibility that future generations might live under institutions that truly served the people rather than exploiting them.